What did you find out about your child's daycare that made you see red? Last Thursday, I received a call that my daughter's daycare was on fire. By the time I got there, they were already loading my Gabriella into the ambulance, and I could see the vicious burns covering her ears and neck. She had an oxygen mask on her, and something I should have paid closer attention to was how she seemed to be the only child who got seriously hurt. Every other kid was fine, maybe some dust on them and a scratch here and there, but nothing more. I got in the ambulance with Gabriella, and during the ride to the hospital, her heart rate dropped to a quarter of what it should be. She started turning purple. We managed to arrive, and she was taken to the back immediately. The doctors left me waiting without an update for 7 hours. When they came back, they told me my Gabriella was gone, or at least the Gabriella I remembered was. The lack of oxygen to her brain had caused severe damage. She was in a coma. Her doctor said she'd likely wake up, but told me to prepare for permanent brain damage. 25% chance she comes out normal. That night while I was at her bedside, the paramedic who brought Gabriella in sat down next to me. Sir, I need to tell you something. We found your daughter in the employee bathroom at the daycare. The door was closed. She was the only child left in the entire building. My eyes went wide. His words didn't make sense at first, and then they did. Someone put Gabriella there and left her to burn. The next morning, I confronted Mrs. Hamilton, the daycare owner. She was sitting at her desk in her second location. I expected her to be equally as shocked to start investigating, but when I asked why Gabriella was in that locked bathroom, she just kept shuffling papers. Unfortunate events happen in emergencies. People panic, and you're no saint either. You're always 15 minutes late for pickup. My staff is exhausted dealing with parents like you. My jaw dropped as I asked her if she was serious. She just looked up with these cold eyes. Your daughter has always been extremely difficult. Maybe someone just needed 5 minutes of peace, and coincidentally, the fire started. 5 minutes of peace. That's what my baby's brain damage was worth to her. I was walking back to my car, shaking with rage, when another parent called out to me. Lisa, whose 4-year-old Grace was in the toddler room. She looked nervous as she approached. I heard about Gabriella. I'm so sorry, but I need to tell you something. Grace keeps having nightmares about the fire. She says she saw Mr. Victor carrying a baby into the staff bathroom right before the smoke started. She heard crying, and then the door closed. My knees buckled. Victor, the afternoon aide who always volunteered for diaper duty. That afternoon, I waited by Maria's car. She was another daycare worker, and when she saw me, she tried to turn back, but I called out to her. Maria, please. My daughter has brain damage. I need to know what happened. She looked around the empty parking lot, then her shoulders sagged in defeat. Victor takes babies into that bathroom and locks the door. We hear them crying, but can't get in. We told Mrs. Hamilton, but Victor is her nephew. She said mind our business or we'd lose our jobs. The day of the fire, when the alarm went off, Victor ran out of that bathroom alone and slammed the door behind him. I asked if all the kids were out, and he said yes, but his face was white and his hands were shaking. He left your baby in there to burn because he couldn't explain why he had her locked in that bathroom. My whole world stopped at that moment. I had to rest against my car so I wouldn't collapse. That evening, I drove straight to the police station. I told the first officer I saw about the fire, how Victor left my baby locked in that bathroom to die and had been doing something to her in there. The officer's expression changed from concerned to uninterested. The second Victor's name was mentioned. So you think this Victor was inappropriate with your daughter? Do you have proof? I have testimonies. He locks babies in there for 30 minutes. He just adjusted his belt to interrupt me. That's negligence at worst. File a civil suit. He left her to burn, I shouted, capturing everyone's attention. Not without evidence, he didn't. I realized they weren't going to help. That night, I did the only thing I could think of. I called my 2 best friends, Kyle and Benji, who I've known all the way since juvie, and told them everything. I sent them the pictures of their goddaughter hooked to machines. We met up at a bar where we discussed everything. By 1 a.m., we were already outside Victor's rundown apartment building with everything we needed. A stranger unlocked the main entrance, letting us in, and once inside, we changed into all black outfits under the stairwell. We crept up this door, where Kyle picked his lock, and we snuck in. Victor woke up 10 minutes later to the feeling of a knife against his cheek, and 3 men dressed in black standing around him. He tried to scream, but the sock in his mouth prevented that. I explained why we were here, and his face went even paler when I mentioned Gabriella. The 3 of us dragged him to his feet, and not so kindly brought him into his kitchen. He was crying, attempting to bargain with us, saying we could rob the place and he wouldn't snitch. But Benji took out his roll of duct tape and taped Victor's now heavily bruised legs, arms, and midsection to his chair. He even taped his mouth. That's when I approached him. Now, I'm gonna take the tape off your mouth, and you will tell me what you were doing with Gabriella in that bathroom. I placed my knife to his neck. I grabbed the edge of the tape and ripped it off his mouth in one quick motion. Victor gasped and started breathing hard through his mouth. I pressed the knife harder against his throat until a small drop of blood appeared. His whole body went stiff. I leaned in close enough to smell the fear coming off him. You're gonna tell me exactly what you did to my baby girl in that bathroom. His eyes went so wide I could see white all around them. This wasn't about money anymore, and he knew it. Victor started crying harder and snot ran down his face. I never touched any kids like that, I swear. I just needed them quiet when I was on the phone with my girlfriend. The words came out fast and desperate. I didn't believe a single word. Kyle walked over to the counter and picked up Victor's phone. Let's check this then. Victor tried to shake his head but couldn't move much with all the tape. Benji grabbed Victor's head with both hands and held it completely still while I took the phone from Kyle. I swiped through his photos and my stomach turned. There were dozens of pictures of babies in that bathroom. My hands started shaking when I saw Gabriella in 3 of them. The pictures weren't sexual, but they showed kids crying with tears streaming down their faces. Some had red marks on their arms where someone grabbed them too hard. I held the phone right in front of Victor's face and showed him the photo of Gabriella crying in that bathroom. Her little face was red and scared. Explain this. Victor's crying got worse and he started talking fast. She was too loud, okay? She wouldn't stop crying and the bathroom has thick walls so no one could hear. My hand holding the knife started shaking. I didn't mean for the fire to trap her. I panicked and ran. I thought someone else would get her. Kyle walked over to Victor's mattress and lifted it up. A black notebook fell onto the floor. He picked it up and started flipping through pages. His face got darker with each page he turned. This sick bastard kept records. He showed me the notebook and I saw dates and times with kids' names next to them. Gabriella's name was there 17 times over 2 months. Some entries said 45 minutes next to her name. My vision vision went red, and before I knew what I was doing, I pulled back and punched Victor as hard as I could in the stomach. He doubled over as much as the tape let him and made a sound like all the air left his body. Benji grabbed my arm and pulled me back. We need him awake to get everything on record. Remember the plan. I was breathing hard, and my knuckles hurt, but I nodded. Kyle took Victor's phone and started setting it up to record video. He propped it against the toaster so it had a clear view of Victor's face. I walked back over and put the knife close enough for Victor to see it, but not touching him. You're gonna confess everything. The bathroom stuff. Leaving Gabriella in the fire, your aunt knowing about it, all of it. Victor was sobbing and gasping for air, but he started talking when I moved the knife closer. He told the camera about locking kids in the bathroom when they cried too much. He admitted he'd been doing it for 6 months. He said his aunt knew, but didn't care because he was family. He talked about the day of the fire and how he ran out and left Gabriella because he couldn't explain why she was in there. Every word made me want to hurt him more, but I kept still. After 10 minutes of him talking and crying, Kyle stopped the recording. We all stood there looking at Victor taped to the chair. Benji cracked his knuckles and said we should hurt him more for what he did. Kyle shook his head and looked at me. If we kill him, Gabriella loses her dad to prison too. Think about that. My hands were still shaking, and I wanted nothing more than to make Victor pay for every second my daughter suffered. But Kyle was right. Gabriella needed me. I walked up to Victor one more time. You're gonna live, but everyone's gonna know what you did to those kids. Victor started crying harder and begging us not to tell anyone. I ignored him and picked up his phone. I dialed 911, and when the operator answered, I said there'd been a break-in at Victor's address and hung up. Kyle grabbed the notebook, and I made sure the confession video was still on Victor's phone. I wonder what made Victor think he could keep getting away with locking crying babies in that bathroom for months. There's something deeply wrong here. Taking pictures of crying children, keeping detailed records like it's some kind of twisted hobby, and his aunt just. We moved quick toward the back door. Benji checked outside first to make sure no one was around. The three of us slipped out into the dark and immediately went different directions. I walked fast, but not running to my car parked 3 blocks away. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. I drove the speed limit back toward the hospital where Gabriella was fighting for her life. The whole drive I kept thinking about those photos of her crying in that bathroom. By the time I got to the hospital parking lot, the sun was starting to come up. I sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down before going inside. The security guard at the entrance nodded at me like he did every morning. I took the elevator up to the ICU and walked to Gabriella's room. She looked so small in that big hospital bed with all those machines around her. I sat down in the chair next to her bed and took her tiny hand in mine. The burns on her neck were covered in white bandages. Her chest moved up and down with the ventilator. I stayed there holding her hand and watching her breathe. The machines kept beeping and clicking around us while nurses came in every hour to check her vitals and write stuff on their clipboards. Around 7 in the morning, I finally dozed off in that uncomfortable chair, but woke up when my phone started buzzing nonstop with texts from people I hadn't heard from in years. The first message from my cousin just said to check the news, so I pulled up the local station's website, and there it was. Victor's face all over the homepage with a headline about him being found beaten and tied up in his apartment. The article said he was refusing to cooperate with police and wouldn't say who attacked him, which made sense since telling them would mean explaining why someone would want to hurt him that bad. I put my phone away and focused on Gabriella, adjusting her blanket and making sure the tubes weren't pulling on her skin, when Mrs. Hamilton burst through the door around noon with her face all red and angry. She pointed her finger at me and started yelling about how she knew I had something to do with what happened to Victor, and she was going to make sure I went to prison for it. The nurse who was changing Gabriella's IV bag told her she needed to lower her voice or leave, and I just sat there calmly telling her I'd been right here all night with my daughter. 2 more nurses came in because of the commotion, and they all confirmed they'd seen me regularly throughout their shifts, checking on Gabriella every hour like clockwork. Mrs. Hamilton stormed out, but I knew this wasn't over, especially when 2 detectives showed up an hour later with their badges out and serious looks on their faces. Before they could even start asking questions, I told them I needed to call my lawyer, pulling out the business card for Javier Nunez that I'd kept in my wallet since my last run-in with the law years ago. Javier answered on the second ring, and when I explained the situation, he told me to say absolutely nothing, except that I was at the hospital, which the medical staff could verify. The detectives tried asking me about my relationship with Victor and whether I blamed him for what happened to Gabriella, but I just kept repeating that my lawyer advised me not to answer questions without him present. They left after 20 minutes but said they'd be back, and I knew they were probably going to dig into my past and find out about my time in juvie and everything else. That afternoon, while I was getting coffee from the vending machine, my phone lit up with notifications from every local news app I had, all saying the same thing about breaking news regarding the daycare fire. Someone had sent Victor's confession video to Channel 7, and they were playing clips of it on air, his tear-stained face admitting to locking babies in the bathroom, and specifically talking about leaving Gabriella there when the fire started. Within an hour, it was everywhere, shared thousands of times on social media with parents commenting about how they always thought something was off about him. The police station started getting flooded with calls from angry parents who wanted to share their own stories about their kids coming home upset after Victor's shifts or having nightmares about the mean man at daycare. The department couldn't ignore it anymore, with Victor's own words playing on repeat across every local channel, and reporters were camping outside the station demanding to know why nothing had been done sooner. My phone rang that evening, and it was Rita Oakley, the fire investigator who'd worked the original scene, saying she was reopening her investigation based on this new information. She needed to examine the daycare's bathroom door and lock mechanism to understand exactly how a toddler couldn't escape from inside, and she wanted to know if I remembered any details about the door from when I'd picked up Gabriella before. I told her about how that bathroom door had one of those old locks that you needed a key for from the outside, and how the handle on the inside had been loose for months, according to what other parents had mentioned. She thanked me and said she'd be in touch once she had more information, and I could hear in her voice that she was taking this seriously now. The next morning, I saw on the news that Mrs. Hamilton's second daycare location got shut down by the city for emergency inspection after parents started pulling their kids out and demanding investigations. The reporter was standing outside the building showing all these parents scrambling to figure out new childcare arrangements while city inspectors went through both buildings with clipboards and cameras. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, but when I read it, I knew it was Kyle using a burner phone, saying he was going to visit family out of state for a while and to take care of myself and Gabriella. We both knew what he really meant, that he needed to get far away from here in case the police started connecting dots about who might have paid Victor a visit that night. 3 days after the video went viral, the prosecutor's office held a press conference announcing they were filing charges against Victor for child endangerment and involuntary manslaughter. The prosecutor explained that while the confession video itself couldn't be used in court since it was obtained illegally, it had led them to find enough independent evidence, including witness statements and physical evidence from the daycare. 2 days later, my phone rang at 6 a.m., and it was Benji saying the cops were at his door asking about Victor's assault. I told him to call his girlfriend first and make sure she'd back up his alibi before letting them in. By noon, he texted that they'd released him after his girlfriend swore he was with her all night watching movies, and the neighbors confirmed seeing his car parked there since dinner time. We all knew she was lying, but she stuck to her story, even when they pressed her about specific details and timelines. I spent those days bouncing between the hospital ICU and the office of Javier Nunez, a lawyer I knew from the old neighborhood who specialized in keeping guys like us out of prison. Javier went through every possible scenario with me, explaining how without physical evidence or Victor identifying us, the cops had nothing solid to build a case on. He said the key was staying consistent with my story about being at the hospital all night, which the nurses had already confirmed multiple times. The security footage from the hospital parking garage showed my car arriving at 11 p.m. and not leaving until morning, giving me an alibi that would hold up in court. A week passed, and I was holding Gabriella's hand like I did every morning when her fingers twitched against my palm for the first time since the fire. The movement was tiny, but it was real, and I called the nurse immediately, who paged the doctor. He examined her for 20 minutes, checking her reflexes and responses to different stimuli before telling me not to get my hopes up too much. Small, involuntary movements were common in coma patients and didn't necessarily mean she was waking up, but it was still the first positive sign we'd seen. That same afternoon, Rita Oakley called to update me on her investigation into the daycare's physical structure. She'd gotten a warrant to examine the bathroom where Gabriella was found and discovered the interior door handle had been broken for at least 6 months based on rust patterns and paint wear. The mechanism that should have allowed someone to unlock the door from inside was completely detached and hanging uselessly behind the handle plate. Mrs. Hamilton had signed off on 3 different maintenance reports acknowledging the broken handle, but never authorized the repair because it would have meant closing that bathroom for a full day. Rita said this added premises liability to the criminal charges, since Mrs. Hamilton knowingly maintained a dangerous condition that prevented escape. More daycare workers started reaching out to investigators now that Mrs. Hamilton couldn't threaten their jobs anymore, since both locations were shut down. Maria gave a sworn statement to the prosecutor's office, detailing 17 separate incidents where she tried to report Victor's behavior to Mrs. Hamilton. She had dates, times, and even showed them text messages where she documented her concerns to protect herself legally. Another worker named Sandra came forward with photos she'd secretly taken of bruises on baby's arms that matched the grip pattern of adult hands. She'd been too scared to report it before, but now she handed over her phone with dozens of pictures spanning 8 months. Victor got formally arrested the next week, and Javier heard through his connections at the courthouse that things went bad for him immediately during intake. The other inmates found out he hurt kids within hours of him arriving at county jail, and by that first night he'd been beaten so badly they had to transfer him to the medical wing. How did those daycare workers keep such detailed records without anyone noticing? Maria's 17 documented incidents and Sandra's secret photos show they were building evidence for months while still working there every day. His face was unrecognizable according to the intake photos Javier managed to see, with both eyes swollen shut and his jaw potentially broken. They moved him to protective custody after that, but even there he wasn't safe because guards would accidentally leave doors unlocked or look the other way when certain inmates needed to use the same hallway. 2 weeks later, the detective investigating Victor's assault came to see me at the hospital while I was sitting with Gabriella. He pulled me into the hallway and told me they were closing the case due to lack of evidence and Victor's refusal to cooperate with the investigation. Victor wouldn't identify his attackers and claimed he couldn't remember anything about that night, probably because he knew testifying against us would mean admitting what he'd done to those babies. The detective looked me straight in the eyes when he said they had no leads and no witnesses willing to come forward, and the way he said it made it clear he knew exactly what happened but didn't care enough to pursue it. The next morning, I watched the news showing Mrs. Hamilton getting arrested at her house for child endangerment and failing to report abuse. The cameras caught her trying to cover her face with her jacket as they walked her to the police car in handcuffs, while reporters shouted questions about how many children were hurt under her watch. Seeing her in cuffs felt like some kind of justice, but it didn't fix Gabriella's brain or bring back the daughter I'd lost to the smoke and flames. Within days of her arrest, a group of parents filed a massive civil lawsuit against the daycare company and Mrs. Hamilton personally for negligence and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I joined the suit even though I knew money wouldn't undo the damage or make Gabriella whole again, but at least it might cover her medical bills and the specialized care she'd need for the rest of her life. 3 weeks after we'd visited Victor in his apartment, I was reading to Gabriella from her favorite book when her eyes suddenly opened for the first time since the fire. My heart jumped and I dropped the book, calling for the nurses while trying to stay calm and not scare her. But when her eyes focused on my face, there was no recognition there at all, just fear and confusion as she started crying and trying to pull away from me. The nurses rushed in and had to sedate her because she was thrashing so hard she might have hurt herself, and I stood there watching my own daughter scream in terror at the sight of me like I was a stranger who meant her harm. The next morning, the neurologist called me into his office and pulled up Gabriella's brain scans on his computer screen. He pointed to these dark spots all over the images and explained that the lack of oxygen had killed huge sections of her brain tissue. The parts that control speech, movement, and basic thinking were mostly gone. He told me straight out that Gabriella would never walk again, never talk again, and would need someone to feed her through a tube for the rest rest of her life. My hands started shaking as he went through the list of what she'd lost. She couldn't control her bladder or bowels anymore. She'd need special equipment just to sit up without falling over. The child who used to run to me laughing when I picked her up from daycare was gone forever. A social worker came in while I was still trying to process everything and started talking about state facilities that could handle kids like Gabriella. She had brochures for places that looked like hospitals where they'd keep her in a bed all day with other brain-damaged kids. I pushed the papers back across the table and told her no way was my daughter going to one of those places. She tried explaining how hard it would be to care for Gabriella at home, but I didn't care. I'd figure it out somehow because she was still my baby, even if her brain was mostly dead. That afternoon, I got a call from the prosecutor's office telling me Victor's trial date had been set for 3 months out. His public defender was already trying to argue that Victor had diminished capacity from stress and shouldn't be held fully responsible for leaving Gabriella in that bathroom. Hearing that made my blood boil, so bad I had to hang up before I said something that would get me in trouble. 2 weeks later, I was signing discharge papers to bring Gabriella home when a guy I knew from the neighborhood pulled me aside in the hospital lobby. He told me Dexter Guthrie, this violent guy doing time for nearly beating someone to death, had become Victor's new cellmate. Word was spreading through the jail about what Victor did to those babies, and Dexter had kids of his own on the outside. The guy said Victor probably wouldn't make it to trial and asked if I wanted to pass along any message to stop it. I just shook my head and walked away without saying anything because Victor made his choices, and now he could live with the consequences. I quit my job the next day since Gabriella needed round-the-clock care, and there was no way I could afford a nurse. Money got tight real fast with all the medical bills and equipment we needed. Lisa and some other parents from the daycare started a GoFundMe that raised enough to cover the feeding pump and special wheelchair. Every morning I'd wake up at 5 to prepare Gabriella's medications, crushing pills and mixing them with water to push through her feeding tube. Then I'd change her diaper, give her a sponge bath, and do the physical therapy exercises the hospital taught me. Her arms and legs were getting stiffer every day from not moving on their own, so I had to bend and stretch them to keep the muscles from locking up completely. 2 months after the fire, I was watching the morning news while doing Gabriella's exercises when they announced Victor had been found dead in his cell. The reporter said he'd been beaten to death by his cellmate Dexter over some dispute about commissary items, but everyone knew that was just the official story. They showed Victor's mugshot for about 10 seconds before moving on to the weather, like his death didn't matter at all. I kept doing Gabriella's leg stretches and didn't feel anything except maybe relief that we wouldn't have to sit through a trial. Within days of Victor dying, Mrs. Hamilton's lawyer contacted the prosecutor about a plea deal. Without Victor to blame everything on, she didn't have much of a defense left. She pleaded guilty to child endangerment and got 5 years in state prison, though everyone knew she'd be out in 2 with good behavior. The local news barely mentioned Victor's death after that first day, and nobody seemed to care that he was gone. His own family didn't even claim his body, so the county had to bury him in the cemetery they use for homeless people and criminals nobody wants. I started learning all of Gabriella's new needs, like how to clean the feeding tube so it wouldn't get infected, and which medications had to be given at exact times. The occupational therapist showed me how to position her in the wheelchair so she wouldn't get sores from sitting in the same spot. Every day was exhausting with constant diaper changes, tube feedings every 4 hours, and exercises that seemed pointless since she never got better. 3 months after everything went down, Kyle showed up at my door with a toolbox and some wood planks. He'd been laying low out of state since that night with Victor, but came back once it was safe. He spent the whole weekend building ramps for Gabriella's wheelchair and installing grab bars in the bathroom. We worked side by side for hours without ever mentioning what we'd done to Victor or how things ended up. He helped me rearrange the living room to fit all of Gabriella's medical equipment and built special shelves to organize her medications and supplies. Benji showed up a week later with his pregnant girlfriend and asked if I'd be the godfather to their baby. I said yes right away, even though part of me worried his kid might someday need the same kind of loyalty we'd shown each other that night with Victor. The civil lawsuit against the daycare moved forward over the next few months with depositions and meetings with lawyers. Hamilton's insurance company finally offered $2 million to settle everything rather than go to trial. 7 families would split it, which meant my portion would cover maybe 5 years of Gabriella's care if I was careful with every penny. I started taking Gabriella to a special needs daycare 3 mornings a week once she was stable enough. The staff there actually knew how to handle kids with brain injuries and feeding tubes. They had special chairs that supported her head and nurses who checked her medications. It let me work part-time stocking shelves at the grocery store, which helped with bills. 6 months after the fire, I was doing Gabriella's morning exercises when she looked right at me and smiled. It was crooked and probably just random muscle movement, but I chose to believe she knew who I was. The other parents from Hamilton's daycare started meeting up once a month at the community center. We shared information about special needs services and which doctors were actually helpful. Lisa brought pamphlets about state programs, while another mom knew about free therapy equipment loans. We all signed petitions for better daycare oversight and wrote letters to state representatives. The local news station called wanting to do a follow-up story about what happened. They filmed at City Hall where new regulations were being announced, like mandatory background checks for all daycare workers and surprise inspections. The reporter interviewed me about Gabriella's progress, and I tried to explain how one person's negligence destroyed my daughter's future. The city council scheduled a hearing about funding for childcare oversight and asked me to testify. Standing at that microphone was terrifying, but I told them about finding Gabriella in that bathroom and how she'd never walk or talk normally again. The council members took notes and promised to consider increased funding, though I knew promises meant nothing. The timing of Victor ending up with Dexter Guthrie as a cellmate seems awfully convenient, doesn't it? Makes me wonder who pulled those strings behind the scenes to arrange that particular housing assignment. A full year passed with Gabriella slowly getting stronger. She could track objects with her eyes now and seemed to recognize my voice when I talked to her. The physical therapist said it was remarkable progress considering her initial prognosis of total vegetation. Her feeding tube still got infected sometimes, and she had seizures that required emergency medication. But she was alive and fighting, which was more than the doctors expected. Hamilton got released from prison after serving 2 years of her 5-year sentence. The parole board board decided she wasn't a threat anymore and needed to care for her elderly mother. I found out through the victim notification system and spent that whole night pacing my apartment wanting to track her down. But Gabriella needed me here, and revenge wouldn't fix her brain damage. Hamilton left the state within days, according to the prosecutor who called to warn me. At the special needs daycare, I started noticing another parent who was always there when I dropped off Gabriella. Her name was Kelly, and her son had similar injuries from abuse at a different facility 2 years ago. We started having coffee in the lobby while our kids were in therapy sessions. She understood things other people couldn't, like how exhausting it was changing adult diapers on a child who should be potty trained. She knew about the guilt of being relieved when they slept through the night because it meant a break from the constant care. Kelly showed me tricks for preventing bed sores, and which generic medications work just as well as the expensive ones. Her son could use a communication board with his eyes to say basic words, which gave me hope Gabriella might learn that too. We exchanged numbers and started texting about doctor appointments and therapy progress. Sometimes we'd meet at the park with our kids in their special wheelchairs and watch other children play on equipment ours would never use. It wasn't dating exactly, but having someone who understood this life made everything slightly less impossible. The daycare staff mentioned Gabriella was responding well to music therapy and suggested I play songs at home. I bought a cheap speaker and played kids' songs during her exercises, which sometimes made her eyes focus better. Every small improvement felt huge, even if she'd never be the toddler who used to run around my apartment laughing. Kyle stopped by occasionally to help with repairs or bring groceries when money was tight. He never mentioned that night with Victor, but I could see the guilt in his eyes when he looked at Gabriella's feeding tube. Benji sent pictures of his new baby and promised to bring her by when she was older, though we both knew that might never happen. Life became a routine of medications and therapy appointments and insurance fights and small victories that nobody else would understand. One morning, the prosecutor called to tell me they were creating a special unit for daycare abuse cases because of what happened to us. She said they were calling it Gabriella's Law around the office, even though the official name was something boring with too many words. I hung up feeling like maybe something good came from all this pain. The months turned into a year, then another, with Gabriella making tiny bits of progress that felt huge to me. I was changing her diaper one afternoon when she looked right at me and made a sound I hadn't heard in 2 years. Dada. The speech therapist who was there for her session dropped her clipboard. She rushed over and listened as Gabriella said it again, clearer this time. Dada. The therapist warned me this might be the only word she ever manages, but I didn't care because my baby knew who I was. That night I played the video I took for Kelly, and we both cried watching it over and over. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 2 a.m. with Kyle on the other end asking me to bail him out. He'd gotten caught breaking into a warehouse and needed $5,000. I sat on the edge of my bed looking at Gabriella's medical bills spread across my kitchen table. I told him I couldn't help this time. He started yelling about loyalty and how I'd changed, but I hung up because Gabriella needed every penny I had. Kelly understood when I told her the next day at the park while our kids sat in their wheelchairs. She didn't judge when I admitted I'd probably helped hurt Victor that night he got beat up. She just squeezed my hand and said she would have done the same thing if someone hurt her son like that. We started spending more time together, eating dinner at each other's apartments while the kids did their exercises. She taught me how to stretch Gabriella's legs properly to prevent her muscles from getting too tight. I showed her the trick I'd learned for getting her son to swallow his medicine by mixing it with chocolate pudding. One afternoon, the occupational therapist brought in a new device that tracked eye movements. She spent 3 hours teaching Gabriella how to look at pictures to communicate basic needs. The first time Gabriella looked at the picture for water when she was thirsty, I wanted to throw a party. 2 weeks later, she figured out how to string pictures together to make simple sentences. She looked at love, then daddy, and I lost it completely, crying harder than the night of the fire because she could finally tell me how she felt. The director of the special needs daycare pulled me aside one morning to ask if I wanted a job there. She said I was already there every day anyway, and they needed someone who understood what these families were going through. The pay was terrible, barely above minimum wage, but it meant I could stay close to Gabriella all day. I took the job immediately and started the next week helping with feeding times and diaper changes for 6 other kids with similar injuries. Time kept moving whether I wanted it to or not. 3 years had passed since the fire, and our life had found its own weird rhythm. Gabriella would never walk or talk normally, but she was alive and safe and knew she was loved. Every morning I'd get her dressed and fed through her tube. Then we'd go to the daycare where I worked. Every evening we'd come home to the same apartment where Kelly and her son would usually be waiting for us. She had a key by then and would start dinner while I got Gabriella settled. We'd gotten good at this life nobody plans for. Kelly brought up moving in together one night after the kids were asleep. She said we were already basically living together anyway, and combining rent would help us both afford better equipment for the kids. I agreed, and we found a bigger place with wider doorways for the wheelchairs and a bathroom we could modify with safety rails. The move took 2 weeks with both of us packing around therapy schedules and doctor appointments. Gabriella and Kelly's son seemed to understand each other in ways that made no sense to us. They'd sit next to each other in their chairs, making sounds back and forth like they were having conversations we couldn't follow. One afternoon, I got a letter with no return address, but I recognized Benji's handwriting immediately. He wrote that he'd moved his family to Arizona for a fresh start after some trouble with the cops. He included a picture of his baby girl who was walking now and said he'd tell her stories about her brave uncle and cousin Gabriella when she got older. He said he thought about that night with Victor sometimes, but had no regrets because Gabriella deserved justice. I burned the letter after reading it 3 times just to be safe. The 4th anniversary of the fire came on a Thursday, just like the original one. I always took that day off work to stay home with Gabriella, and this year was no different. I was reading her favorite book about a bunny who goes on adventures when she used her device to say something new. She looked at the picture for happy while I was reading, and I stopped mid-sentence. She did it again, more deliberately this time, happy, while looking right at me. After everything we'd lost, she could still feel joy and wanted me to know it. 2 weeks after that breakthrough with the device, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said she was Victor's mother and needed to meet me. I almost hung up, but something in her voice made me listen. She asked if we could meet at the coffee shop on 3rd Street the next morning. I agreed, even though my hands were shaking. The next day, I left Gabriella with Kelly and drove to the meeting. Victor's mother was already there. This small woman with gray hair who looked nothing like her son. She stood when she saw me and her eyes were red from crying. She told me she'd been following the news and knew what Victor had done to my baby. She said she should have seen the signs but was too blind about her own son. Then she pulled out an envelope from her purse and pushed it across the table. Inside was $10,000 in cash that she'd saved for Victor's bail before he died. She said it belonged to Gabriella now since her son took so much from her. I stared at that money for a long time before taking it. That afternoon, I went straight to the medical supply store and bought Gabriella the best communication device they had. The new one had more options and could track her eye movements better than the old one. I also got specialized therapy equipment the insurance wouldn't cover. Using Victor's family's money to help Gabriella felt like the only justice we'd get. The device made such a difference that within months, Gabriella was using it to say dozens of words. 3 years passed with slow but steady progress. Then a reporter called asking if I'd do an interview for the 5-year anniversary of the fire. I thought about saying no, but realized other families needed to hear our story. The news crew came to our apartment and filmed me talking about Gabriella's progress. I told them about the signs of abuse that everyone missed and how important it was to listen to kids. Gabriella said Dada after 2 whole years. My mind is racing trying to understand how her brain made that connection after such terrible damage. What pathways stayed intact that let her remember that word? The segment aired on the evening news, and within days my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Other parents whose kids had been hurt at daycares were reaching out for advice and support. Kelly suggested we start a support group since so many people needed help. We began meeting monthly in our living room with 6 other families. Everyone brought their kids and we'd share resources while the children played together. The group grew so much we had to move it to the community center. That fall, Gabriella started kindergarten at the local school with a full-time aide assigned to help her. The first day was terrifying, but she handled it better than I did. Her aide would help her use the device and move around the classroom. The other kids were curious at first, but quickly accepted her as part of the class. She'd never be like the other kids, but she deserved every chance to learn alongside them. 6 months into the school year, we had Gabriella's IEP meeting with all her teachers and therapists. Her main teacher brought up something that made me tear up. She said Gabriella always noticed when other kids were upset and would use her device to say, okay, and friend to them. Even after everything that happened to her brain, my daughter still had empathy for others. The teacher said Gabriella was teaching the other kids about kindness without even trying. Kelly and I had been together for almost 4 years by then and decided to make it official. We planned a small ceremony in the park with just close friends and family. Gabriella would be our flower girl with her wheelchair decorated with ribbons and flowers. The morning of the wedding, Kelly helped me get Gabriella into her special dress. We'd practiced her rolling down the aisle with the flower basket attached to her chair. When the ceremony started, she did it perfectly while everyone watched with tears in their eyes. The officiant asked if anyone objected, and that's when Gabriella used her device. She looked right at us and selected happy, making everyone laugh and cry at the same time. After the ceremony, we had a small reception at the community center where our support group met. Life wasn't anything like I'd planned when Gabriella was born healthy and perfect. She'd never walk or talk normally and needed constant care, but she was alive and safe and loved by so many people. Some nights I still woke up in a panic thinking about that bathroom and the fire. I'd go check on Gabriella sleeping in her special bed with all her equipment around her. Seeing her there breathing steadily would calm me down. We'd survived everything, and Victor was gone while my daughter was still here fighting every single day. Thanks for hanging out with me through this whole story. Hope my random questions didn't get too annoying along the way. Until we cross paths again, take care. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.